properly as it should be with Indigenous communities and organizations in any part of the world. And I'm presenting this in part because this has been a very strong contribution to the way I work in different countries. So in a way, I've been using basic principles developed by the First Nations in Canada to work with in other countries as well with Indigenous partners. In Canada, as in many other countries, we've had a terrible history of research with Indigenous people, involving Indigenous people, what was called helicopter research. Researchers go into communities, essentially do research on people and leave, and essentially expropriation, a new form of colonization under the guise of science. And so this long history, fortunately, has been increasingly changing, and again, essentially through the hard work, and the struggle of Indigenous organizations and communities in Canada and other places of the world, of course. So what the First Nations principles of OCAP, which are ownership, control, access, and possession, it's related essentially to information in terms of research, mostly, also evaluation. And so these are principles that have been very well developed and essentially applied to any research that now we do with Indigenous communities and organizations in Canada. And fortunately, no university, at least to my knowledge, in Canada, would allow through ethics boards to do research involving Indigenous peoples, particularly in this case First Nations, but this applies to others, without outlining clearly how these principles will be applied. So ownership, just to clarify, has to do with ownership of the information, but it's not simple. It's not the possession, which is at the end. I'll talk briefly about. But whose data is this? Whose information is this? And there's a difference, an important difference between community-level, community-owned information as a collective, and also the issue of individuals with their own personal information. And this is related to the relation of First Nations to their cultural knowledge, their data, their information. It is distinct from possession, which I will talk about in a second. The next one is the control, and this is a crucial aspect because the way it has to do with how research is planned and implemented. So it means the control or meaningful involvement in all aspects and phases of the research. So it's about governance around the stages of the research and the different aspects, and the management of the information and the processes. And this relates to resources, to policy, to the review processes, to conceptual frameworks that are developed, to data management, etc. So this is, the control seems very small here, but really it's a huge aspect of the principles of OCAP. And the process of the research is crucial, and that's what control is about. Of course, the issue of access. The First Nations must have access to information, data about themselves and their communities wherever it is held, and First Nations involved in the management decision-making regarding access to their collective information as well. And this has been an issue of tension years ago with our university. I recall we used to have a center for First Nations research, and the whole issue of making the university was quite restrictive in how certain First Nations would access that information. That has changed, and that's for the good. So we have had very good evolution around that. Of course, with proper protocols. And finally, the possession of the data, for instance, is the idea behind it is that data that's possessed in possession of others can carry risk of breach, but also of misuse. And this whole issue of trust is crucial between the owner of the information and the possessor of the information. So it could be like it's happened that, for instance, data could be now in a cloud, used to be servers, that's within the university, but the university is seen as a steward of that, but not the possessor. Because the possessor still is the First Nations community organization that is allowing the university to have that information in their servers or in their cloud. But again, we have had, particularly Manitoba in our province, a big shift here, where First Nations Health and Social Secretariat has now become not only the owner, but also the possessor of the data, most of the data, or a large part of the data that relates to the First Nations people in the province. But there are other aspects of the data, or for instance, under the possession of the Manitoba First Nations Health and Manitoba Center for Health Policy, which is a university center. But when studies are being done in relation to Indigenous peoples, there's a whole process around this OCAP that is utilized. But that data, because that data also has data that's non-First Nation, non-Indigenous, and so that's where it gets more complicated. But it is as when the study or analysis are done that relate to data about Indigenous peoples in Manitoba, in this case, then OCAP is applied in terms of how that data will be used. So I'll just wrap up. Sorry, the phone is ringing. With this part, and then go with two case examples, is that the key, in my experience, and what really OCAP in a way seems to try to indicate in a framework, but it's more than just that framework or those principles. It's the idea that we can't do research without building relationships. And so, and this is also a point of tension sometimes with our universities, and sometimes also with students that are conducting research with First Nations or Indigenous communities, organizations, is the issue of time to establish trust. Students sometimes are pressed for time, and that's a source of tension. But you cannot do these things properly without dedicating enough time. So taking time to establish trust, essentially it's through that building of relationships, taking time to know the community, taking time to research local protocols, cultural practice, and traditions, respect for cultural integrity and Indigenous knowledge, and respect for non-traditional forms of knowing and gathering information. So for me, as a key element in all of what I'm talking about is this issue of building relationships. And so what I'll talk very briefly about two quite distinct studies that we did in partnership that showcase a little bit what I mean by what I just talked about. So I don't have many, I just have the titles here, so I'll just talk about it. I'm showing these examples because they're quite distinct. So one was a study done a few years ago. We did in partnership with the Kalinago with the Kalinago of the island of Dominica. It was done in partnership with the Kalinago Council and local university. In Dominica is a small country, 70,000 people in the Caribbean. It's incredible to think the tragedy of this. They're known as Cara, but the proper name is Kalinago. Roughly 5,000, 6,000 people live in Dominica. They're the only remaining indigenous group in the Caribbean, essentially, the main one that's remaining, and that is precisely the place where Columbus arrived. So the Caribbean, in that sense, is one of the most dramatically aspects of the genocide in the Americas in relation to colonization. So what we did there, the idea for the study came from the Kalinago Council. So they were interested in understanding a few aspects of the health situation, and therefore we essentially did 2 trips just to get to know each other, have conversations, work on, and then workshopping what could be, first of all, what their interests were. Second, focus what could be done in terms of what would be the research questions and what would they use this information for in terms of why would it be relevant to them. And then obviously the whole process of developing and working out with them the proper methodological approaches to do this health assessment, this community health assessment. And through this work, they end up identifying as the priorities. One was the aspect of nutrition. And the second was the issue of care for elderly people and people with disabilities in the community. So the whole study then was the survey ended up being developed, etc., was done with those 2 key content ideas in mind, and that was the decision that was done with by the Kalinago team that was part of the study. And of course, the survey was developed and it was conducted by community surveyors. And then, which I thought was really one of the most very interesting strengths of this experience, was that there were a number of community gatherings done afterwards with the findings of the study that were so it was the chief and other council members and us were part of these community gatherings where the findings were shared to the community. Some of them were very large, like 50, 60 people, and there were a lot of discussions that occurred using that evidence for them, which helped them make decisions around the programming that they wanted or needed. As well, some of these presentations were done to the public health system and also with chief and council members and research team. So I think one of the main limitations we've had in the research that we do is that we don't put enough time and effort and resources to this part of working the findings, sharing them, and having deep conversations with the organization and community members. So yes, publishing is great, important, peer review, etc. But this making the findings take life for the communities is, I argue is a bit more important. It's more important. Unfortunately, the reward system in universities does not really value this as much as they should. My theory is that it's easier to count publications in a CV and when you're in a committee to reward academics than it is to understand the important work that it takes to do proper sharing of findings. So that's my little critique to our university system. The next one, I'm showing this because it's very different from the previous one. NSYU is a large health insurance organization, Indigenous health insurance organization in Colombia. And when I say large, it's large. It has 240,000 people enrolled. 80% of them are YU. And this is in Colombia, in La Guajira, in the northeast part of Colombia. Therefore, because it is a large insurance, a nonprofit, by the way, insurance organization, which was created by the YU authorities in 2001, they have a very large data set of administrative data in terms of health utilization, healthcare utilization. And so we've been working in partnership with them for many years in different type of initiatives. There was a large HIV initiative that we had years ago with NSYU and Universidad de Antioquia from Colombia. We've had a few other, we've done a lot of different capacity building initiatives, etc. But this study funded by the Inter-American Development Bank was again identified by NSYU as priorities in terms of the themes they were looking for. So the idea was to utilize as much as possible their administrative data to assess two what they called intercultural health programs that they have. One was the intercultural hostels that they have in urban centers for people that when they need to go for treatment to urban areas, they can stay with their families. And they're culturally appropriate hostels, meaning the food that is YU, a lot of the elements within the hostels are YU, etc. And also the other program that they have, which is a very important program, among many others, is the bilingual guides. And here the idea was to assess how bilingual guides facilitates or not access to healthcare, also the hostels as well. So here the study, it was a very large study with a large team. Again, the questions, the research questions were decided essentially by NSYU. They were an integral part of the team at all stages. We had an agreement, going back to my initial part of my presentation, a written agreement in which essentially the principles of OCAP were formalized and with adaptations to the Colombian context. And so that is the agreement that we still have, and that we apply to any product that's coming out of the study. The study has been finished. There are a few publications that are coming out, but more importantly, already there's been a number of workshops with NSYU around the findings, and so they can make use of them for their to adjust their programming. And finally, a very nice thing also was that with the funding we did during the one full year, a bit of a diploma program with them in relation to strengthen their capacity and as it relates to epidemiology and use of health information for staff of NSYU and other of their network of indigenous health service organizations. So I'll finish here. I mean, there's of course tons to unpack on all this, but these are two, in a way. One is a very small study, the other one is quite a large one. And again, the organizations were totally different. But the essence in terms of the principles and the processes that were used are essentially the same. And I think that's the whole point that I wanted to make. The whole issue of the relationship. These were done over, I mean, we were able to do this study. By the way, the last one was done mostly during COVID because of the long-standing relationship that we've had with NSYU for, I would say, I think almost 15 years now. In terms of the Kalinago, that was a shorter study in terms of the relationship process, but it took at least 3-4 years, even though it was a very small study. It was done, it took 2-3, I would say 3 years at least to do it, precisely because of the relationship aspects of it. Is that okay, Ana Lucia? I hope I didn't disappoint you too much. Thank you.
Well, it's perfect. Thank you so much, Dr. Mignone. Next, we're going to have Dr. Sarah Radcliffe. She is a professor of Latin American geography here at the University of Cambridge. She holds a BS in geography and anthropology from the University College London and a PhD on migration, rural households, and Andean development from the University of Liverpool. Currently, she's working across 4 main areas, which is geographies of indigenous citizenship, intersectional dynamics of power, development, and new forms of knowledge production, the colonial geographies, and equality in diversity, policy practice and people in Ecuador's Buen Vivir, which is a little more of what she's going to be sharing with us. So with that, welcome, Professor Radcliffe. The floor is yours.
Thank you very much. Welcome, everybody. Thank you for the invitation to talk. I want to share a few slides, although I think before I finish my talk, I'll come out of the slides and just sort of wrap up with that. So I shall share my screen. Can you see that? Yeah. Good. Okay, so the talk I want to give today relates to this title I've put up here, which is about Buen Vivir in Ecuador, and I'll say a bit more about that in a minute. But the overall theme I think that I wanted to bring to this panel is a question about the sort of struggles over indigenous well-being that we have to take into account under particular conditions, and that relates very much to what I call, others as well call, coloniality. In other words, the relations of power and marking difference and exerting control over different groups, including indigenous populations around the world. And I'm using this notion of coloniality to try and remind us that while we're talking about the Ecuadorian case, I think it's also useful to think of these wider challenges to indigenous achievement of what they consider to be well-being. And there are very common themes that come up against indigenous people in different parts of the world. So we were asked by the Indigenous Studies discussion group to think a bit about sort of Buen Vivir in comparative context. So I thought I would start by saying that Ecuador is, of course, a single country, but it is quite interesting because in 2008, the constitution of the country was ratified in a new form, making Buen Vivir, or living well, putting it at the very center of the state's responsibilities to its citizens and making it the basis for the distribution of resources within the country. So these were very broad, very ambitious proposals and what became legislation and programs and so on. And these did reflect the activism of indigenous movements within Ecuador in coalition with feminist and environmentalist movements and allies to bring their understandings of what would be a just and dignified and respected life for Indigenous populations in their country. So if we're thinking comparatively, we have to be very careful about generalizing from the Ecuadorian context. We've got a very particular history. We've got a very particular weight of Indigenous movements in defining the Buen Vivir that goes into the Constitution. The other comparative element that I want to bring in, and Javier's talk was excellent to sort of lead into this, was the fact that Indigenous well-being is, of course, a term that varies so much depending on who you are and which positionality you're speaking from. And our research has to address that issue, and also arguably our analysis of the term Buen Vivir, which can be used by in such different ways by different groups, not least Indigenous people versus other groups who maybe are non-Indigenous but who are using that term. So I thought I would just situate my thinking about this a bit more, because coloniality to me is not just about racial capitalism and colonial modern governmentality, but it's also crucially about the politics of knowledge production and the systematic patterns of power and control over knowledge and its dissemination and its making, which mean that certain kinds of knowledge are foregrounded and validated, whereas other forms of knowledge are suppressed or dismissed as being merely empirical instead of having wider relevance or importance. So the understanding here that we might get is a sort of comparative understanding of what work Buen Vivir does within the Constitution and in the formal politics of Ecuador, but also think about the politics of knowledge around the Indigenous meanings of well-being that we see involved in that country. So my slide here starts with a picture of some Quechua farmers. I've worked in Chimborazo province with the Quechua indigenous people for many years now. I think it's getting on sort of 25 years, and using many of the principles that Javier outlined. Another element on that first slide is this graph showing the intersectional dynamics between gender and ethno-racial inequalities in access to schooling. You have here on the right-hand side, the age range of 25 years to 65 years on the left. And you can see here that the marker for Indigenous women shows the least access to education, and Indigenous men, again, there being a big gap with non-Indigenous men and women here. And this highlights the ways in which, when Ecuador went into ratifying and trying to bring about Indigenous well-being under Buen Vivir, the country was marked by huge, steep inequalities of access to core facilities and opportunities. So one of the things that is very interesting about Ecuador in a comparative context, and this came out of my work with the Quechua women in Chimborazo province, was the ways in which Indigenous women, such as the women pictured here, were, for the first time in their lives, able to listen to the government program for Buen Vivir and say, that's our sumak kausai, that's our form of well-being. And probably for the first time in women's lives, they felt that there was a direct connection between their forms of knowledge production about Indigenous well-being and what it would mean to have constructive and progressive change, and seeing something similar to that in the initial pronouncements and promises of the Buen Vivir national development programs. And what you can see here too is a reflection of the fact that this came out of very active Indigenous movements involving both women and Indigenous men. So yes, I'm not sure I'm going to talk about this now, except maybe that just to highlight that I'm trying to get away from an essentialized idea of Indigenous people and an essentialized idea of Buen Vivir in these things, and we have to always put them in a relation of sort of dynamic interaction across different powerful groups defining these things. Okay, so to situate the Buen Vivir in Ecuador a little bit more firmly, we can identify three strands that were very much part of the debates in the Constituent Assembly in 2007, and then went in to varying degrees into the 2008 constitution of that country. So we have the first element of Buen Vivir, which is that Buen Vivir was and this was the term always used in Spanish, that was about getting rid of, dismantling neoliberalism. It was about re-establishing national sovereignty over resources and the income of the state, and also delinking from the geopolitical actors of the sort of post-Cold War period and creating more interesting connections to countries such as Venezuela and China and so on. And this was a very important strand and led to the state development planning, which was called Buen Vivir, based on the idea of a rights-based approach to development. But we have then a second strand, which links back to some of the environmentalist movements, but also Indigenous and other allies. And this was an ecological and post-development strand, rather a utopian strand, in which there was going to be a really radical retransformation of the ways of doing things in Ecuador in order to bring about a human thriving, including, of course, Indigenous thriving, but generally across different groups were going to be thriving, and also Pachamama, or Mother Earth, would be thriving under this utopian element to Buen Vivir. And then the final one, which of course is of most interest to us today, is the idea of the Indigenous perspectives and contributions to what became Buen Vivir. And this is a non-materialist assertion of alternative ontologies. Sumak Kausai is the Quechua term for a set of relations which are balanced ones between humans and the more than human world, in a sense of community and in a sense of justice and equality. And this, I should mention, is very much associated with the Amazonian Quechua groups and with the Andean Quechua groups. It is not necessarily expressed in the same way or in the same term by different Indigenous groups within the country. But it's also very much a sort of riposte to colonial modern power as a project against, which has been expressed as a controlling and threat of less than high quality life, a threat even of death and bad living for Indigenous populations. So even after the constitutional change was adopted in the country, we had very high expectations among Indigenous leaders of both the Amazon and in the highlands of the pattern of possibility of this Buen Vivir that was established as a constitutional principle and as the basis for state action. As you can see from these two quotes, the expectations were very high, and the both in terms of the international implications of it, as for the local implications for getting beyond neoliberalism, which had been the target of sustained Indigenous movement critiques for the deleterious effects it had on Indigenous well-being in that country. But what we find in, or I found in my communications with Indigenous women and Indigenous leaders in the Andes, and particularly in Chimborazo, is that what went alongside that appreciation by the leadership of Buen Vivir, there was also, among people who were ordinary farmers and had no links to Indigenous leadership roles, was a sense in which Buen Vivir was not the same as Sumak Kawsai, and that there was a sort of equivocation between those two things. There was both a move to try and condense those things at a national level, but Indigenous women at the grassroots were very careful to sort of disentangle those two very different kinds of projects and trajectories. So you can see from this quote, which I won't read out, but you can see here that there were a number of different things which spoke to how the state should change. In other words, this is about a citizenship project for Indigenous people as much as a sort of local autonomy in harmony with nature. But it is also crucially about a whole range of different things that are being expressed here. So it seems to me, and this was my argument in the Dilemmas of Difference book, that we have quite an important shift in the politics of knowledge around Indigenous well-being during this process of the movements by Indigenous people for change at the national level, and then also in the subsequent critiques that they make of the Buen Vivir policy. And there is both a sense of ownership over Buen Vivir and Sumak Kawsai because of the trajectory of that idea through their movements into the state, but also there's a sense in which they have the right and the epistemic basis for questioning the knowledge around which a state definition of Buen Vivir gets articulated. So we start to see later in this process an increasing identification of the gap between the well-being of Indigenous people in their everyday lives and the sort of promise of Buen Vivir. And again, I won't necessarily read through these quotes, but you can see here that there's a number of different elements of importance here. And, you know, and these are just some of the quotes that I gathered, you know, which highlight that sort of sense of ownership over Buen Vivir and the validity of Indigenous women's voices in the conversations about how it should come about. And here again, you've got some more quotes about the issue of the gap between Buen Vivir. We don't have Buen Vivir, says Dahlia, for example. And she is complaining about the sort of little gifts that are being given out by the government. Okay, I'm going to stop sharing for a second. If I have a little bit of time, just to wrap up, I wanted to finish by highlighting the ways in which I think it's very easy to overgeneralize about what would make Indigenous Buen Vivir happen. And I think we have to be very conscious of where we're speaking from and who we are taking as the sort of emblems, if you like, of a particular version of Buen Vivir. And my view is that this is always going to be a contested process because, as was hinted at in some of the quotes that I gave there, we have a tension even within the Ecuadorian Indigenous movement over the priorities of Indigenous women relative to Indigenous male leaders. And so what constitutes well-being is also fractal. It also kind of comes in and shakes up our understanding of what Buen Vivir would look like within Indigenous populations. So thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Professor Radcliffe. That was very, very interesting and certainly very thought-provoking. Next, we're going to have Dr. Mauricio Torres-Solís, who is an agricultural engineer from the Central University of Ecuador, and he holds a master's and a doctorate in science from the College of Postgraduates in Mexico. He has over 15 years of professional experience in social innovation processes, and currently his focus is on generating knowledge about alternative approaches to development from the perspective of thinking of Indigenous people in Latin America. So welcome, Dr. Torres-Solís.
Thank you so much. Thank you for this invitation. First, I wanna apologize because the English is not my second language, but I try to do my best. Okay, can I share my screen? Yeah. Oh. Can you see?
Not yet.
No.
Now?
No, not yet.
Oh, okay, I have problems here. Suppose I chose the good.
So you should be share screen and then your desktop.
Yeah, but I have an Apple computer. Go say share screen. Okay, I will try another way.
Or if you want, you can also send it to me and I can share it if necessary.
Yeah, I think it's a good idea. For your email?
Yeah, that will be perfect.
It's done? Did you receive?
I am waiting for it to come.
Okay. You got it?
No, not yet. Yeah, no. Oh, there we go. I have it.
Okay.
I'm gonna start sharing it.
Just wait a second. I will send one video too. I am sending a video, a short video.
Wonderful. Your presentation is already on the screen whenever you want to start.
Okay. Okay. Okay, the object of this discussion is to convey the idea of good living present in the Totonac community of Puebla. Okay, I try to take advantage of the time. I want to skip that slide. Yeah, that's okay. The indigenous municipality of Huehuetla is part of the cultural region known as Totonacapan, which stretches across the Mexican states of Puebla, Hidalgo, and Veracruz. The territory of Huehuetla is located in the Sierra Norte of Puebla, Mexico. It is home to about 16,000 inhabitants. Huehuetla is a very unique municipality. According to the official figures, it is one of the most disadvantaged areas in the country, with 86% of its population living in poverty. Nevertheless, Huehuetla exhibits exceptional cultural richness and linguistic activity, as 89% population preserve and speak the native language known as Totonaca de la Sierra. Okay, in this part, I want to show you the video. Do you got the video?
Yeah, I'm gonna play the video.
Uh, all this presentation is about the ethnographic study. And that study was in the period 2013 to 2019, like part of my studies. Okay. I can listening. I think we have technical problems here.
You couldn't see the video?
No, I can see and I can listen in the video, but the video is try to introduce where is Huehuetla, where is the idea about the Tapashuan Latamat. This is part of this study. The video is in Totonac language, it's complete in Totonac language, but try to show that short trailer about all this idea. Okay. Could you continue for the next two? Okay, the next two, please. Okay. To comprehend the notion of the Totonac good living, I will approach its manifestation from three levels. The first level is in green, is the personal level. The family level is in red, and the community level. It is at the community level where the ethical, political, and administrative structures become more evident, enabling us to theorize the total way of life within the debates of political economy, development, well-being. Okay. For the first level, at the personal level, the concept of Totonac good living is closely related to the process of local spirituality. It is important to understand how the term tonalism operates as it enliven and the bond that the Totonac people have with the natural environment in which they live. Tonalism represent a set of beliefs about the existence of a mystical connection between the human beings and the organisms of this earth. According to several others, this bond between the essence of human beings, animals, and plants even extend to death. In other words, if a plant or animal dies and its essence is connected to the human being, that human being will also die. When this moral framework, two total concepts emerge. The first one is in the right, uh, knows kushta, which can be translated as winged insect, or specifically in Huehuetla as a green fly. This insect represents a common tonal figure. The idea of kushta has remained present in Totonac philosophy, especially in oral tradition tales, traditional medicine practice, and academic works by authors such Kellyanne Palerm, Icon, Ellison, Govers, among others. Thanks to the reflection and conceptual construction within Huehuetla, kushta can be interpreted as the mystical bond that arises between human beings and the organisms of the earth. In Huehuetla, kushta is seen as the quality of a spirit that is not as singular but fragmented into 13 parts, 12 manifested in the organism of the earth and one part within the human being. These parts are connecting in common complementarity relationships capable of transmitting experience, evolving or devolving as element of the vital principle. The second concept in green in the left comes like is listagni, sometimes translated as heart. However, of the Huehuetla Totonacs, the interpretation goes beyond that, as the understanding of the terms encompasses not only the physical aspect, but also it is immaterial part, the movement, especially the heart and its beating. Tac, 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 tac. Thus, the Huehuetla reflection on Listagni demonstrate why the term is also interpreted as life, and at the same time as something that sustains that life. This understanding allows for the application of the concept of listagni not only to living beings, but also to inanimate objects, expanding its notion to elements such as hills, water, family, position and responsibilities in the community, and service. In other words, in Huehuetla, there lies the idea that everything has heart and beat, united and inseparable, based on reasoning, where everything has life and at the same time sustains that life. This way of seeing Kushta and Listagni opens the door to understanding of the human being, society, and nature as interconnecting realities in a process of permanent union that could be called a system of life. Now, why are these Totonac concepts important? The answer lies in the feeling that arises in a person when they are in harmony both with the kushta and listagni. This is the first sensation of happiness, or pashuwa in Totonac, that the Totonacs feel when they relate harmonies to every object and natural element in the environment that surrounds them. The second level, the red, at the family level, the idea, the concept of pashuwa, that translating happy, extends to the community as well. According to the Totonac reflections, pashuwa not only depends on the harmonious relationship between the body and its essences, which means being mindful of the element present in the natural world, animal, water, etc., but also taking care of the social and familial environment. As Listagni contributes to the flourishing of the human being. Therefore, it is necessary to take care of both the natural and social worlds in order to maintain physical, mental, and spiritual integrity, as well as joy and happiness. For those individuals who still embody this local morality and identity, a different concept of well-being is reflected, distinct from the Western perception or perspective, and described as pashuwa or happiness. Pashuwa departs from its conventional counterpart, as it is not part of the introspect idea of personal flourishing and the development of one's own capabilities. Its practice is not monastic, as it carries a moral responsibility that prioritizes others in order to achieve happiness. Therefore, Pashuwa is perfected in the collective realm as a result of family coexistence and communal activities, giving rise to the notion of communal joy known as Tapashuwan. Tapashuwan. This is the main idea of this entire discussion. At the community level in blue, the Totonac concept Tapashuwan Latama emerging, which reference to the idea of living in happiness. In Tapashuwan Latama, life, Latama, in Totonac, is fully integrated on a biological, human, and spiritual level. Its enjoyment is delight, its happiness. Happiness Tapashuwan in Totonac is associated with creative, liturgical, and recreational work flows through constant dialogue between the community, the divine, and the natural world. The subjectivity of Tapashuwan Latamal is embodied through the implementation of practical principles that maintain the spiritual, social, cultural, economic, and environmental harmony of the community. Principles such in the borders, in blue, as faith and the act of offering to the divinity, solidarity, and the act of serving the community. This is a special concept serving to the community called Talakachiskuwin. This is very, very important. Talakachiskuwin. Under Talakachiskuwin is Litai, translated like the civil and religious roles in the community. Okay. Other practice like the development of agricultural activities and livestock farming under a clear seal of spiritual reciprocity. From this analysis, Tapashuwan at the community level, the logical of the indigenous organization and governance emerges. In order to understand this local process and structure, we start with the concept Talakachiskuwin, the service of the community. When we talk about the Talakachiskuwin, community service, the notion of obedience is embedded within it. From this perspective, service with obedience is reaffirmed as offering, as the service is not only for the community, but also for the divinity. From Talakachiscowin for serving, the exercise of authority arises when civil or religious roles are practiced in favor of the community, or litai in Totonac. So, litai and Talakachiscowin go hand in hand because civil or religious roles is a service to the community, and at the same time, the service to the community is a burden, an extra work that adds to everyday life. In May, since that this additional work could be somehow affect the family economy. However, among the Totonacs of Huehuetla, the responsibilities when fulfilling civil or religious roles are not practiced individually, as the strong social bond becomes evident, built upon God parenthood. Thus, each family receives the support of the community. This leads us to think that each member of the community has a distinct role that distinguishes them from the others and enables them to contribute the collective. Therefore, the Huehueteca social structure can be seen as an extended family that encompasses the entire town. On the other hand, it seems that the community prevails in the daily life of the people from Huehuetla, conditioning them in some way in their work and behavior, as it demands loyalty and commitment, giving the impression that it prevails over their freedom. However, the community does not pose any obstacle to stop living it, as an idea of freedom linked to Tapashuan is promoted. For the Totonac people of Huehuetla, being free means being able to engage in activities that allow them to experience that happiness. They don't see themselves as distant or living outside the community because it is through the community that they achieve their freedom. In this context, the village, Cachiquín in Totonac, and its elements like Talacachiscuwin, the service, become indispensable for the community members, and the community members become indispensable for the village, making them inseparable. It can be affirmed that the Totonac freedom of Huehuetla does not seek personal gain, but the well-being of all, setting aside the dominant mindset of waiting to be free on my own and free from others. Continuing with the idea of the civil or religion roles, litai is understood as something that corresponds to someone, like an obligation, that is inseparable from the idea of obedience, where the fulfillment of task and as the will of the one who exercises it is subordinated to the interests of the community. It is the community itself that assigns individual the social competences that enable the feeling of tapashuan. From this perspective arises the concept of leadership with obedience, as according to it, the one who leads knows how to obey, and the one who obeys knows how to lead, encompassing working, healing, governing, etc. So, Talakachiscuin, a principle practiced in Litai, where the one who leads obeys and the one who obeys leads, propose a different democracy incomparable to its Western counterpart, where the one who leads does not obey, and the one who obeys does not lead. It moves further away from the ideals left and right of the current democracy. This contradiction explains why the nation-state project, in its eagerness for development and modernization, constantly seek to eliminate Talakachiscuin and Litay from the local thinking and practices. In Huehuetla, there are several civil roles, for example, Mayul, Pushku, and one in specific, Takamal, translated as the one who stands out, the one who doesn't hesitate, interpreted as the song of the people. This title corresponds to the highest position granted by the community through the Council of Elders. It is important to highlight that in the 90s, the civil role of Takamalt became visible within the Huehuetla, with the Huehueteca indigenous government. With this, the reactivation of another administrative structure took place, reflecting another form of the authority known as Tamashtumit. Tamashtumit is understood as creating unity and result in the formation of a community assembly. Many Huehueteca people agree that assembly or Tamashtuming in Totonac is an expression of the organization of the community. In the right, in blue, the struggle of the Huehueteca people to preserve their ethnic identity and thereby attain a state of happiness in life has been ongoing. Today, the promotion of this way of life, propelled by institutions such as Huehueteca Indigenous Court, the COYOM, the Indigenous Higher Education Center, which encompasses the field of traditional medicine implemented in community hospital of Huehuetla, as well as the civil and religious roles executed in each locality. However, Huehuetla, like other Mexican municipalities, experienced the effect of external macro policies that consistently impact the local population. As a motion known by the Totonacs of Huehuetla as Talipuwan, in yellow in the bottom. Talipuwan, which refers to a type of sadness or unhappiness that can be understood as disharmony experienced within the community. This is how the people from Huehuetla feeling Tapashuwan. And if you wanted to translate, Tapashuwan is happy new life, o vida en felicidad in Spanish. It's a similar idea to the Buen Vivir in Sudamérica or Centroamérica. Okay. Continue to the next. Yeah. That's it. I hope that you understand me.
Wonderful. Thank you so much, Dr. Torres-Solís. And now we can move to our last speaker, which is Dr. Treena Orchard. Dr. Orchard is from Western University, Canada. She's an associate professor and undergraduate chair. She's an anthropologist, author, and activist who researches sexuality, gender, and the politics of health and more marginalized groups, and within the context of her own life. She has published over 60 peer-reviewed journal articles and book chapters, and has been featured plenty in the media and in many other forums. So With that, welcome, Dr. Orchard.
Great. It's nice to be here. I really enjoyed all the previous presentations. I hope we have ample time for some discussion afterwards. So I will start sharing my screen. How many times I've done this and why is it acting funky? People see the PowerPoint?
Yeah,
Yeah.
perfect.
Yeah, great. All right, so I will begin. I've entitled the talk, Stretch Thin, Navigating Wellbeing Among Indigenous Youth. So I'll begin with a little bit of an overview about Indigenous youth and well-being, and then I'm going to sort of discuss two abbreviated case studies. The first is my premier experience doing field work as an anthropologist during my master's degree, and during that time I worked with Indigenous youth in northern Quebec. And the second case study is my most recent and active Indigenous project that I've been involved with, which also focuses on young people. And then I'll have a few concluding reflections. And at one point, I'll be reading some of my field notes from the second project as well. So Indigenous youth under the age of 25 in the Canadian context are among the fastest growing populations in the country, and they make up about 50% of the total on-reserve population. It's important to note that Indigenous folks in Canada do not live exclusively on reserves or in remote settlements. Only about half of the total population who identify as Indigenous do. Many youth in both urban and on-reserve communities experience different kinds of intergenerational trauma, structural violence, and various health adversities stemming from historical and ongoing colonization, including housing and food insecurity, increased risk of substance use, sexual violence and murder, especially for women and girls, as well as different mental health challenges. And those are typically the way that Indigenous youth are framed in the dominant media. And alongside this kind of research and this particular framing, about the socio-structural and political conditions that prevent Indigenous youth from participating equitably in society. There are other studies that explore the remarkable knowledge, creativity, and strengths-based solutions that young people possess as they seek to express themselves and contribute to the well-being of their communities and define their own pathways to well-being and wellness. So this picture always really makes me smile. Woo, back in the day, this is circa 1997. And the first case study is the Naskapi Nation of Kawachikamash, which is located, you can see that on the little map there, in what we now consider sort of northern Quebec and also Labrador. And the Innu word Naskapi is said to mean the people beyond the horizon. And this is where I lived. I lived in that community for 4.5 months in 1997. Just a little bit of, a little bit about this particular community and this group of people. The Naskapi were one of the last communities of Indigenous people living in more remote settings to be forcefully moved by the government, certainly in the Canadian and perhaps even the North American context. And they were moved from a further northern, more Arctic setting to where they currently live now in 1956. And part of that movement was linked to signing a modern day treaty in this region in 1978 called the Northeastern Quebec Agreement. And at the time when I was doing my master's, which was 97 to 98, young people in the community of Kawachikamash and a sister community in on coastal Labrador were represented often in the media and also in certain social science research settings as being lost, caught between two worlds, and also in a perpetual identity crisis. This is connected to the high rates of suicide and many media stories related to things like sniffing gas and just being in general a lost generation. And I wanted to know more about what the Niskapi youth and the youth in these other communities, how they think about their lives, and also how other community members perceive changes that have gone on during adolescence itself, which was a remarkably, which was a life phase that had undergone a lot of very rapid transition. So I spent 4.5 months in the community, lived with a family who were amazing and patient. I'm still connected with them on Facebook. I did a number of interviews with young people, as well as older adults and a few different elders. I went on the land, went hunting, did archival research, volunteered at the gym, which was, you know, a great introduction to the community. I hung out with older teens in the neighboring town that was close by, and it was a really fully immersive experience. In general, you know, the findings that I was able to observe and learn about contributed to both the anthropological study of adolescence, as well as the very small amount of literature about young people among the Niskapi. So some of the key findings relate to the Indigenous, the local experience of adolescence, which didn't really align with sort of the Western model of being a teenager or a young person, which is really driven by this notion of the identity crisis. It's often seen that, you know, this is the central task of being a young person going through adolescence, the idea that hormones are all out of control, you know, parents sigh and roll their eyes, I have teenagers, right? It's this very sort of moral panic and often sort of disregarded phase of life. And it's experienced quite differently and understood quite differently in the community of Kawachikamach. Because it is very new, the term teenager, which is obviously it's an English term, was being used in a number of different ways. It could be used to self-identify and as a peer group, but I often heard it used in more of a slur, and it can be used or in a pejorative way to refer to someone who is immature or being irresponsible, like, oh, he's being such a teenager, which is interesting. And in terms of the lived experience of young people, they experience quite a lot of marginalization within their own community. They're often seen and spoken about as being so different from previous communities. And also not just different, but somehow less than or just really misunderstood. And that was challenging for them. But they also were able to, at the same time, experience some of those tensions. But they had very strong ties with their families and really strong friendship groups as well. In terms of attaining adulthood, you know, that has changed a lot. School, spending time with peers, acquiring jobs, as well as housing are now seen as being essential to adulthood. And for young women, having children is also one of the ways that one comes of age. In the past, this was more focused on spending time in the bush and the acquisition of traditional skill development, which still does occur, but to a much less degree among young people. Sexual relationships are definitely key to the teenage experience and fraught with challenges that could be seen as universal. They're stressful, they're fun, very awkward, they're powerful. And then there are some aspects of sexual relationships in this community that are kind of unique with respect to the fact that the prospect for sexual partners is quite limited if you take out the people who you're related to, right? And so often when a relationship would go sideways, a young couple would break up, the stakes felt very, very high because the question is, you know, who else do I have left to choose from at the end of the day? And so that impacted the young men in particularly powerful ways. That was an important finding from the study. And one girl, so in reference to looking at the role of traditional life, going to the bush, spending time on the land, which young people do less than in the past, but it still has meaning. One girl who hardly went to the bush at all said that the most important thing she has been taught was to know about the bush because the Niskapi could end up living there again. I heard that often during my research. Another girl told me that she would rather be a boy because boys can hunt. And a few of the boys said that they enjoy hunting. and that this enjoyment is something their parents see as very important, because through hunting, as one boy said, I will remember them. So that many, many ties are revealed there with respect to these traditional activities, the communal identity. Very, very, very powerful. I'm going to shift to the second case study, which is the one that's more recent. We're out of the 90s, and we're sort of 2019, 2022, or 2020. And this is actually almost in the same kind of region. We're talking subarctic, not quite Arctic, not quite 60 degrees north. And this is Casablanca Lake First Nation. And they too were forcefully moved by the government a little bit later than the folks in Kawachikamach. It's a fly-in community, is pictured to the bottom right. They're signatories of Treaty 9, which was signed in 1905 and 06, which is also known as the James Bay Treaty. And the project that I was involved with, and still am, although we haven't been able to get up there since 2020, is the Indigenous Youth Futures Partnership. And it was funded by the Social Sciences and Humanities Research Council of Canada. And it began in 2016. And is still sort of sputtering a little bit. We're trying to decide what to do. We still have money left over, but it's been really challenging to get back up to the different communities. I wasn't there from the very beginning. I only came in sort of around towards the end, so 2019. The aim of the project is to foster resilience with and among Indigenous youth and help empower them to prosper as leaders in their communities. And so I went up to Casablanca, or Cass, as it's known locally, 5 times. The visits were about 3 or 4 days each. And we had 4 youth who were hired as youth apprentices, or sort of our key informants. And the 5th young man also took part in the project intermittently. And these youth we trained them in different aspects of doing research, and also just spoke a lot about their lives, what's important to them. We didn't do individual interviews. It just didn't feel appropriate for the project. And the bulk of our observations were recorded in field notes, which we have 20,000 words and counting. That just felt like a much more amenable way of collecting our data and reflecting on it among the team members. And we also took photos of the different projects that the youth created themselves. And that was one of the fundamental things we wanted to do with these young people, get to know them, which is kind of hard when you're not there for a long period of time. So there are many, many challenges and limitations, to be sure. But spending time with them and also keeping connected online. You know, Facebook is often laughed at for being for old people, but I'm still there. And lots of people I know use it often, including the youth from these communities. And I would certainly comment, and I still do, on pretty much every posting that they make, and try to just keep those ties open and kind of remind them that I care about them in a lot of different ways. And that does go a long way in maintaining relationships when you can't be there in person too often. And one of the key things that we wanted to work on with these young people were youth-led projects. And that might sound like not that big of a deal, but in this community, youth are often spoken about as being a resource, really important, you know, future leaders. However, on the ground and in their everyday lives, they often felt very excluded, and their voices weren't really given much room politically or socially. And so working together to try and figure out how can we change that in a way that isn't to outsiders, you know, bringing in all these ideas and messing things up culturally. I mean, I'm sure we did that anyways, but really trying to encourage and foster the agency that was already there, the creativity and the drive to make a difference for their community. Life can be pretty boring in Cass. There's a lot of long-standing sadness and violence related to colonization, both past and present. And finding things to do with them and encourage them to develop their ideas, to make things that are interesting for other young people. You know, they're really powerful role models for those who are coming up underneath them. And so that was the basic thrust of our visits, trying to liaise with other folks, other adults, other people who had programs at the school, at the library, different social support programs, try and sort of foster some of those connections to kind of help pay it forward with the young people. So some of the key observations, you know, the youth are definitely strained as they experience, and they're trying to assert themselves in a space where, like I mentioned, they're positioned as important, but they rarely experience meaningful inclusion, right? So they've got a lot to navigate. Local leadership structures, they've also excited and nervous, but they did tap into things like youth creativity, right? And they're also doing this while minding their own mental health issues, which ebbed and flowed over the course of the project. And they really were huge resources for their own community. They were frontline workers during COVID, and young people knew that they were a resource and would text them at all hours of the day and the night, and they would try and show up and support the young people the best that they could. And it's just really remarkable what they were able to achieve. And along with that, sort of everyday navigating of all these different things, they were also able to launch a number of youth activities and projects that are kind of connected with and supported by our larger project. And so they did different activities. They made snow angels in the wintertime and took photos of them and had like a competition, which was kind of fun. They had a games night, which they hadn't really done before as a collective, just for young people. And the real sort of cherry on top is in 2019, they had a Valentine's Day dance. And that was the very first formal event that had ever been hosted in Casablanca. And they really wanted it to be a formal event that was about celebrating love, right? And celebrating, you know, the relationships that we have and celebrating that. And at one point in the project, the youth, they came to Ottawa. We were there for a conference. And so a number of the team members, we traveled with the youth to different secondhand stores and other shops, and we got dresses, shoes, suit jackets, pants, so that no one would feel like they didn't have something nice to wear to the dance. And they had a theme. It was like the Enchanted Forest theme. And we sent them up with 2 additional suitcases and other boxes, supplies, anything that they could think of to really make this event special. And it was a huge success. And a lot of community members came out, and there happened to be a bingo going on at the same time, but we still got really good representation, which is no small feat. And it was a very powerful thing for them to experience, because it reaffirmed the fact that they have really creative and powerful agency. And also over time, by showing the local leadership that they were able to hold these really important functions, they had prizes, they were very, you know, iPads, cash, you know, really incredible prizes that they got through their own by writing letters to local agencies, funders. So they were able to show and gain more trust from local leadership, right, over time, which is very important. And this was hard won, right? You know, so they're doing these really amazing projects while also, as I mentioned earlier, navigating some deep community tensions related to not just colonization, but also something that emerged often, I guess also connected with colonization, the lack of knowledge transfer from elders to youth. So there was a real generational kind of gap, and a lot of the youth mentioned that they wish that they could speak more openly with their elders about things in the past as well as the present. So navigating a lot of things at the same time. So I was just going to read field note excerpts if I've got enough time, hopefully. So this is
sure.
Okay, great. This is, we went to interview one of the nurses who works extensively with young people and other community members. And this is from early 2020. So community leaders tend to focus on business and revenue generating initiatives, which make social oriented projects without tangible dollar signs kind of hard to support consistently. Psychiatrists come to the community once a year, and there are huge waiting lists. Some have been waiting for 2 or 3 years. Psychologists come in more often, about every 4 to 6 weeks. In terms of some of the main issues that they have to deal with and help diffuse, drugs are number one, and it's much worse than alcohol, mainly injection, not just cocaine and pills. No fentanyl yet. People are known to drink perfume, antifreeze, bath salts, and motor oil. The Suboxone program for opioid addictions is growing, but it isn't working. The lack of qualified professionals to help with follow-up or support was mentioned several times. There basically is no follow-up after a crisis beyond sending people out for 5 days and then they're right back in the community. When health professionals ask for more assistance, they are told no, which means they have to keep repeating this failed crisis model over and over. In terms of some of the dominant issues among young girls, aged 12 to 17, 18, bullying, suicide attempts and ideation, as well as depression are the top issues. Technology plays a big role, including Facebook, and girls as young as 8 to 10 are coming in with cutting marks, anxiety, depression. Girls can also talk about feeling very neglected, especially from their moms, in terms of receiving attention. And they also mention, especially young girls, a lack of privacy, which makes sense when 10 or more people are living in a house designed for 5. They don't feel cared for. For young boys, different kinds of mental health conditions were discussed as being quite common, and full-blown psychosis was mentioned several times, referring to young men being delusional and also experiencing hallucinations. They get about 2 of these new cases each year, and one nurse, the one who we interviewed, she wondered out loud if there was something genetic because it was only seen among boys. So interesting and stark reminders of the different kinds of things that these young people have to navigate and what life is, what it can be like. There's some images of myself with the youth in the top left, as well as one of the other women who helped with us. She's wearing a green toque, and the others are the young people. That's at the local airport. We were on our way out. And the bottom left is a young girl who I've got permission to include in this presentation. She's sort of like my little sister when I go up there. And so I have a sort of a list of the visioning activity, different kinds of activities the young people were brainstorming about what they want to do as part of our project and just going forward. A lot of different ideas, a lot of really cool, fun, some traditional, some really modern, some a mix of both. So one of the young women who we worked with closely, she said, we're the group of youth who are most known in the community. We're close to people who are well known in the community, and we cause a ruckus. That's why we're noticed. So she's referring to the way that close community connections in terms of families. So there's about 4 or 5 main families in this community. And she and some of the other youth are very close to the most powerful families in the community. And so that gives them a bit more confidence to speak out, to make a ruckus. Right. And so the idea about making a ruckus is about resisting being silenced and also about using their voice. So a little comparative between Kawachikamatch and Casablanca Lake. Kawawat, being a teenager, was very new. They often felt misunderstood. Traumas linked to colonization and the forced move to settled life create very big divides for the teenagers, but what I found is that actually the parents of those teenagers in the 90s are the ones who experienced the really stark shift in life because they were moved from way up north to the southern community. And so that really created a culture clash that was a little bit different than what the teenagers were going through at the time. Boredom, access to firearms and substances, as well as lack of safe romantic partners can really create problems and stress among young people. Adulthood is very gendered, as it, that's not a surprise. Young men in particular struggled to achieve adulthood and sometimes to achieve their own families, which is connected with the fact that there aren't that many jobs available in the community. And there are also very few houses built every year. So in terms of establishing themselves with their children or future children, it was very challenging. Young women, in some ways, could be argued they have a more direct pathway to family and adulthood through having children, which was very, very valued. And many of the young women had more than one child at the time. And looking at Casablanca, one of the big differences between the youth and their parents had to do with the much more nuanced knowledge and freedom and fluidity when speaking about things like trauma, mental health, gender, sexuality. That really came out strong. They experienced, as I mentioned, political exclusion and are often spoken about in contradictory ways as a resource really important for the future, but also as a problem, and that is quite common among youth in general. The youth apprentices, they employed tremendous creativity and agency to resist being sidelined or made to be quiet or just not recognized at all. We cause a ruckus, and they also create a lot of opportunities for other people in their communities. But they struggle with profound traumas and often feel very overburdened. And this came out a lot during COVID, when they were often the ones in full suits, going door to door, doing a tremendous amount of work during COVID. Well-being is a complex, fluid resource in the lives of Indigenous youth that is nourished, and it's also drained of its potential by intersecting sociocultural, historical, and interpersonal factors. They are not the problem they are often labeled as. They are young people with incredible talent, strength, and a desire to break the cycles of violence and trauma the best that they can. And there's just a couple of references there. Thank you.
Wonderful. Thank you so much, Dr. Orchard. And thank you to all the other panelists. I think it was very fascinating, and it was very interesting to see from different perspectives what we understand as well-being and its connection to indigeneity. We still have 50 minutes to questions, so I would like to open the floor, the space for anybody that would like to ask a question for our panelists. Regrettably, Dr. Mignone had to leave because he had another prior commitment, but we still have 3 out of the 4, which I think is going to be